Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked across the dusty land that was now his. The deed in his pocket felt heavier than it should have for such a small piece of paper. 300 acres of scrubland in the Arizona Territory for less than what most men paid for a good horse. The seller had been eager, too eager, and Samuel should have asked more questions. The ranch house stood like a lonely sentinel against the red rocks, its adobe walls cracked and weathered. Samuel had traveled from Missouri with nothing but hope and the last of his family's savings after the bank took their farm. His wife had died of fever the winter before, and there was nothing left for him back east except memories that cut like winter wind. As he approached the house, Samuel noticed something odd. 3 figures sat on the covered porch, still as statues. As he got closer, his heart jumped. 3 young Apache women, maybe 16 to 20 years old, watched him with dark, unreadable eyes. They wore a mix of traditional clothing and pieces of white settler dress, their long black hair braided with colorful ribbons. Samuel stopped his wagon 20 feet from the porch, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle beside him, but the women made no threatening moves. The eldest, with a scar running from her left temple to her jaw, spoke in clear English. "You are the new owner," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Samuel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "And you are?" "We live here," said the second girl, younger but with fierce eyes that reminded Samuel of a cornered wildcat. "We have always lived here." The third girl, the youngest, said nothing but watched Samuel with curious intensity. She held something in her hands, turning it over and over, as Samuel's eyes adjusted to the porch shadows. He realized it was a small wooden cross. "The previous owner didn't mention anyone living here," Samuel said, climbing down from his wagon but keeping his distance. The scarred girl laughed, but there was no humor in it. "John Mackenzie mentioned many things to many people. Most of them lies." Samuel felt a chill despite the desert heat. "What happened to Mackenzie?" "He ran," said the fierce-eyed girl. 3 nights ago. Packed everything he could carry and rode north like the devil was chasing him." "Was the devil chasing him?" Samuel asked, surprising himself with the question. The 3 girls exchanged glances. The youngest finally spoke, her voice soft as wind through sagebrush. "Not the devil. Something worse. The army is coming." Samuel's blood went cold. He had heard stories about the Apache Wars, about settlers caught between the military and native tribes fighting for land that both claimed as their own. The newspapers back in Missouri had painted the Apache as savage killers, but these 3 girls looked more tired than dangerous. "What are your names?" Samuel asked, making a decision he hoped he wouldn't regret. He set his rifle in the wagon bed and took a step closer to the porch. "I am Ayanna," said the scarred girl. "This is Casa." She nodded to the fierce-eyed one. "And our sister Itzel." The youngest girl with the cross looked up and smiled, transforming her face completely. "How long have you lived here?" Samuel asked. "Our whole lives," Ayanna replied. "Our mother worked for the first owner before Mackenzie. When she died 2 winters ago, he let us stay. We cook, we clean, we tend the small garden behind the house. We cause no trouble." Samuel looked around the property with new eyes. Now he could see signs of care despite the general disrepair. A small vegetable garden neatly tended, firewood stacked with precision, windows that, while dusty, were unbroken and had been recently cleaned. "Why didn't you leave with Mackenzie?" he asked. Case's eyes flashed. "This is our home. We were born in the room where you will probably sleep tonight. Our mother is buried under the cottonwood tree by the creek. Why would we leave?" "Because," Itzel said quietly, still turning the cross in her hands, "the soldiers think all Apache are the same. They think we all want war." Samuel felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He had bought a ranch, but he had also inherited 3 young women whose presence could bring the wrath of the U.S. Army down on his head. The Apache Wars were real, and tensions were higher than ever after recent raids on settlements to the south. But as he looked at these 3 sisters, he saw something that reminded him of his own lost family. Ayanna's protective stance reminded him of how his wife used to shield their neighbors' children from harsh words. Case's defiance looked like his own stubbornness when the bank came calling. And Itzel's quiet faith, symbolized by the cross she held, spoke to something deep in his own heart. "The army," Samuel said slowly. "What exactly are they coming for?" "Apache raiders hit a supply train last week," Ayanna explained. "Killed 6 soldiers. The army thinks the raiders came from the reservation, but some say they might have had help from Apache living off the reservation. Apache like you three? Apache like us, Casa confirmed, her voice hard as flint. Samuel made his decision. Well, then we'd better figure out what to do before they get here. How much time do we have? The sisters looked surprised. Itzel stopped turning the cross and stared at him with wide eyes. You're not sending us away? Ayana asked. This is your home, Samuel said, echoing Casa's earlier words. Besides, I could use the help fixing this place up. Question is, are you willing to work for someone who doesn't know the first thing about ranching in Apache country? For the first time since Samuel had arrived, all three sisters smiled. But their smiles were shadowed by the knowledge that somewhere to the south, soldiers were riding north with orders that might not distinguish between peaceful Apache girls and hostile warriors. The war that was coming would test everything Samuel thought he knew about right and wrong, about survival and sacrifice, and about the thin line between justice and revenge in a land where both sides had legitimate claims and legitimate grievances. As the sun began to set behind the red rocks, painting the sky the color of blood, Samuel Morrison began to understand that buying this cheap ranch had cost him far more than money. It had bought him a war he never wanted to fight. The morning came too soon, bringing with it the sound of hoofbeats and the jingle of military gear. Samuel had barely finished his coffee when Ayana appeared at his elbow like a ghost, her face grim. 12 soldiers, she whispered. Coming from the south road. The one in front has captain's bars. Samuel set down his cup and walked to the front window. Through the dusty glass, he could see the cavalry patrol approaching at a steady trot, their blue uniforms dark with sweat despite the early hour. The captain was a lean man with sun-weathered skin and eyes that missed nothing. Where are your sisters? Samuel asked. Safe, Ayana replied, but she didn't elaborate. Samuel stepped onto the porch just as the patrol reached the house. The captain raised his hand and his men halted in perfect formation. Dust settled around the horses' hooves as the officer dismounted and approached the porch. Captain William Hayes, 3rd Cavalry, the man said, touching the brim of his hat. You must be the new owner. Samuel Morrison, Samuel replied, staying on the porch but extending his hand. What can I do for you, Captain? Hayes shook his hand briefly, his grip firm and calloused. We're tracking Apache raiders, Mr. Morrison. They hit a supply convoy 6 days ago, killed 6 good men. We have reason to believe they might be getting assistance from Apache living off the reservation. I'm sorry for your loss, Samuel said, and he meant it. But I just arrived yesterday. I wouldn't know anything about raiders. Captain Hayes studied Samuel's face carefully. The previous owner, John Mackenzie, reported seeing Apache in this area. 3 young women, specifically, said they'd been living on the property. Samuel felt Ayana tense beside him, though she remained perfectly still. Mackenzie told you about them? He did. Right before he hightailed it out of the territory. Hayes's eyes were hard as flint. Funny thing about Mackenzie, though, he waited until after the raid to mention these Apache girls. Makes a man wonder why. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel realized that Mackenzie hadn't just abandoned the ranch. He had deliberately implicated the 3 sisters in the attack, whether out of spite, fear, or some twisted sense of self-preservation. The former owner had painted targets on their backs. Have you seen these Apache women, Mr. Morrison? Hayes asked directly. Samuel met the captain's gaze steadily. I've seen 3 young women who've been caring for this property. They cook, clean, and tend a small garden. They don't seem like raiders to me. Apache raiders don't usually seem like raiders until they're cutting your throat, said a sergeant from horseback, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Hayes held up a hand to silence his subordinate, but his eyes never left Samuel's face. Mr. Morrison, I need to search your property and question these women. Of course, Samuel said. But Captain, these girls lost their mother 2 years ago. This is the only home they've ever known. They're not warriors. Every Apache is a potential warrior, Hayes replied grimly. We've learned that the hard way. As if summoned by their conversation, Casa appeared around the corner of the house carrying a bucket of water from the well. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had grown up in rough country, but she kept her eyes down and her movements non-threatening. Several soldiers immediately reached for their weapons, but Hayes gestured for calm. You, he called to Casa. Come here. Casa set down the bucket and walked slowly toward the porch. Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held her hands visible and still. "What's your name?" Hayes asked. "Casa," she replied quietly. "Casa what?" "Just Casa. We don't use white man's last names." Hayes studied her face. "How old are you?" 18 summers. "Where were you 6 nights ago?" Casa looked confused. "Here, where else would I be? Can anyone verify that?" Before Casa could answer, Itzel appeared from the garden, dirt on her hands and concern in her eyes. She had obviously heard the conversation and come to support her sister. The youngest of the three moved to stand beside Casa, and Samuel was struck by how small they both looked surrounded by armed cavalry. "I can verify it," Itzel said softly. "We were all here 6 nights ago." Casa was sick with fever. Hayana and I took turns caring for her. Hayes looked between the two sisters, then at Samuel. "And where's the third one, Ayana?" "Here, Captain." Everyone turned as Ayana stepped out of the house, moving with the same careful grace as her sisters. Samuel noticed that she had positioned herself so that she could see all the soldiers without appearing threatening. "You're Ayana?" Hayes asked. "I am. The one with the scar?" Ayana's hand moved unconsciously to the mark on her face. "Yes. How did you get that scar?" Samuel expected some story about a raid or a fight, but Ayana's answer surprised everyone. "A mountain lion," she said simply. 3 years ago. It killed 2 of our goats and was coming back for more. I tried to drive it away with a stick." She shrugged. "The lion won that fight." One of the soldiers snorted with what might have been amusement, but Hayes remained serious. "You expect me to believe that 3 Apache women have been living peacefully on this ranch while their people are at war?" "Our people aren't at war," Casa said, her fierce nature breaking through despite the danger. "Some Apache are at war. We are not. All Apache are the same in the eyes of the army," the sergeant called out. This time it was Itzel who surprised everyone. The quiet girl with the wooden cross stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "No, Sergeant. All Apache are not the same, just like all white soldiers are not the same. Some soldiers protect innocent people. Others burn villages full of women and children. Which kind are you?" The silence that followed was heavy as a thundercloud. Samuel saw Hayes's jaw tighten, saw the way several soldiers shifted in their saddles. The girl had spoken a dangerous truth, and everyone knew it. Captain Hayes studied Itzel for a long moment. "You speak English very well." "The missionary taught us," Itzel replied, holding up her wooden cross, "before the army drove him away for encouraging the savages." Samuel watched Hayes carefully, trying to read the man's intentions. The captain was clearly intelligent and experienced, but he was also a soldier with orders and dead men under his command. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes said finally, "I'm going to post 2 men here for the next week. For your protection, you understand." Samuel understood perfectly. The soldiers weren't there to protect anyone. They were there to watch the Apache sisters and wait for them to make a mistake. "That's very thoughtful, Captain," Samuel replied carefully. Hayes mounted his horse and gathered his reins. "Ladies," he said to the 3 sisters, "I hope for everyone's sake that you are what you appear to be. Because if you're not, if you have any connection to the raiders who killed my men, I will find out. And when I do, mercy won't be part of the conversation." As the patrol rode away, leaving behind 2 soldiers who immediately began setting up a camp within sight of the house, Samuel realized that the war had officially arrived at his doorstep. The question now was whether it would stay outside or come crashing through his front door. 3 days passed like a tense game of chess where everyone could see the board but no one dared make the first move. The 2 soldiers Captain Hayes had left behind, Corporal Jenkins and Private Miller, set up their camp under a large mesquite tree about 50 yards from the house. They took turns watching the ranch during the day and maintained a guard throughout the night. Samuel tried to establish some kind of normal routine, but it was impossible with armed men studying every movement. The 3 sisters continued their work around the ranch, but the easy familiarity they had shown on his first day was gone, replaced by careful, measured actions designed not to alarm their watchers. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Samuel was repairing a section of fence when he heard horses approaching fast. He looked up to see a lone Apache rider galloping toward the ranch from the east, bent low over his horse's neck. The man rode like he was being chased by demons, and as Samuel watched, he realized that might literally be true. Corporal Jenkins and Private Miller were on their feet instantly, rifles ready. The Apache rider saw them and changed direction, heading straight for the house instead of trying to flee. This was either a very brave man or a very desperate one. The rider pulled up short near the porch, his horse lathered with sweat and breathing hard. He was young, maybe 25, with traditional Apache dress and war paint streaked across his face. But his eyes held something Samuel didn't expect to see, genuine fear mixed with fierce determination. Ayanna appeared on the porch as if she had been waiting for this moment. She spoke rapidly in Apache to the rider, who responded in the same language. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the urgency in their voices was unmistakable. "Get down from that horse," Corporal Jenkins shouted, running toward them with his rifle raised. "Get down now!" The Apache rider looked at Ayanna, who nodded once. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, but Samuel could see the tension in every line of his body. This was a warrior trying very hard not to act like one. "Who are you?" Jenkins demanded, his rifle still trained on the young man. The Apache looked to Ayanna, who stepped forward. "His name is Nalnish. He is—" She paused, searching for the right words. "A friend of our family." "What does he want?" Private Miller had arrived now, his own weapon ready. Ayanna spoke again in Apache to Nalnish, who responded with what sounded like urgent, desperate words. Samuel saw the color drain from Ayanna's face. "He brings news," she said slowly. "Bad news." By now, Casa and Itzel had appeared, drawn by the commotion. When they saw Nalnish, both girls went very still. Itzel clutched her wooden cross so tightly her knuckles went white. "What kind of news?" Samuel asked, moving closer despite the soldiers' weapons. Ayanna looked at him with eyes full of pain. "The army attacked a peaceful Apache camp yesterday morning. Women, children, old people, most of them were killed." Samuel felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "Where?" 30 miles south of here, near the river crossing." Corporal Jenkins lowered his rifle slightly. "How does he know this?" Nalnish spoke again and Ayanna translated. He was hunting nearby when it happened. He saw the smoke, went to investigate. He found bodies, burned lodges. Her voice broke slightly. "Children. Why should we believe him?" Jenkins asked, but his voice had lost some of its harsh edge. "Because," Itzel said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Those were our cousins. Our aunt lived in that camp." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Nalnish's horse breathing heavily and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Samuel felt the world shifting beneath his feet as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then this young man isn't here just to bring news." Ayanna met his eyes. "No, he's here to warn us. The survivors of the attack, they blame us." "Why would they blame you?" Private Miller asked. Casa answered, her voice bitter. "Because we live with whites. Because we speak English. Because when the army came looking for Apache to blame for the raids, someone pointed them toward the peaceful camp instead of the real raiders. And now the survivors think we helped the army find them," Ayanna continued. "They think we traded their lives for our safety." Samuel began to understand the terrible complexity of the situation. "So now you're caught between the army, who doesn't trust you because you're Apache, and your own people, who don't trust you because you live with whites." "That's about right," Casa said grimly. Nalnish spoke again, urgently, and Ayanna listened with growing alarm. When he finished, she turned to Samuel with desperation in her eyes. "He says some of the survivors are coming here. Tonight. They want to take us back to face judgment for our supposed betrayal." "And if you go with them?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. "They will kill us," Itzel said simply. Slowly, Corporal Jenkins had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. "Now wait just a minute. If what you're saying is true, if there really was an attack on a peaceful camp, then Captain Hayes needs to know about it." "The captain already knows," Ayanna said quietly. "Who do you think ordered it?" The words hung in the air like a curse. Samuel saw the doubt creep into the soldiers' faces as they realized they might be on the wrong side of something terrible. "That's not possible," Jenkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We don't attack peaceful camps, and don't you?" Casa asked. "Then why are 30 Apache women and children dead this morning?" Private Miller was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Corporal, maybe we should ride back and report this." "Report what?" "The word of hostile Apache?" "I'm not hostile," Itzel said softly, still clutching her cross. "I pray to the same God you do. I tend the same gardens. I cry the same tears when children die." "How am I your enemy?" Samuel watched the two soldiers struggle with a reality that didn't match what they had been told about Apache people. These weren't savage warriors. They were three young women whose only crime was being born Apache in a territory where being Apache had become a death sentence. As the sun began to set behind the red rocks, painting the sky the color of blood once again, Samuel realized that the night ahead would test everything he thought he knew about courage, loyalty, and the difference between right and legal. Somewhere in the growing darkness, Apache warriors who had lost everything were riding toward his ranch, seeking justice or revenge. Behind them, an army that had blood on its hands was probably planning its next move, and caught in the middle were three sisters whose only home was about to become a battlefield. The war that couldn't be avoided was no longer coming. It had arrived, and it was demanding that everyone choose a side, even when all the sides were wrong. Night fell like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a tension so thick it seemed to press against Samuel's chest. The ranch house sat in a pool of lamplight while darkness gathered in the surrounding rocks and scrub brush like water filling a bowl. Nalnish had refused to leave, despite the obvious danger his presence brought. He sat cross-legged near the porch, his weapons laid aside but within easy reach, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The two soldiers had withdrawn to their camp, but Samuel could see them moving restlessly, checking their rifles and peering into the darkness. Inside the house, the three sisters prepared for what might be their last night alive. Ayana had armed herself with a long hunting knife that she wore openly at her belt. Casa clutched an old revolver that had belonged to their mother, its wooden grip worn smooth by years of use. But it was Itzel who surprised Samuel the most. The quiet girl who carried a wooden cross had also retrieved something else from their belongings, a Winchester rifle that she handled with obvious familiarity. When she saw Samuel's surprise, she offered a sad smile. "The missionary taught us more than just English and prayers," she said softly. "He said a person should know how to protect innocent life." Samuel checked his own weapons, a shotgun and the rifle from his wagon, but his mind was on larger problems. Even if they could fight off the Apache who were coming for the sisters, what then? Captain Hayes would return, probably with more soldiers, and find evidence of a gun battle. The sisters would be blamed for everything, and Samuel would be labeled as a traitor for helping them. But if he turned the sisters over to either the army or their angry cousins, he would be sending three innocent young women to their deaths. The choice seemed impossible, until Samuel realized he was thinking about it wrong. This wasn't about choosing sides in a war. This was about choosing between right and wrong. Period. Around midnight, Nalnish made a soft sound that instantly brought everyone to alert. Samuel moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, then gradually his eyes picked out shapes moving between the rocks. They came like shadows, silent and purposeful. "How many?" Ayana whispered. "6, Nalnish replied quietly. "Maybe 7. The Apache warriors moved closer, stopping just at the edge of the lamplight. Samuel could see their faces now, painted for war, their eyes reflecting the light like those of hunting wolves. These were men who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. One of them, an older warrior with gray streaking his hair, stepped forward into the light. He spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably that of a man demanding justice. Ayana stepped out onto the porch, her hand resting on her knife but not drawing it. She responded in the same language, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. The conversation continued for several minutes, growing more heated with each exchange. "What are they saying?" Samuel asked Casa, who had positioned herself by the window with her revolver. "The old one is called Grey Wolf. He says we betrayed our own people to save ourselves. He says the army knew exactly where to find the peaceful camp because someone told them." Casa's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Ayana is trying to explain that we had nothing to do with it, but he won't listen." The conversation outside grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, Grey Wolf raised his voice in what sounded like a command. The other warriors began to spread out surrounding the house. "They're going to take us," Itzel said quietly, checking her rifle. "Dead or alive." That was when Corporal Jenkins surprised everyone. The soldier stepped out of the darkness, his rifle held at the ready but not pointed at anyone specifically. "What's going on here?" he called out. Grey Wolf spun to face him, a tomahawk appearing in his hand as if by magic. The other warriors immediately took defensive positions, their own weapons ready. "Soldier," Grey Wolf said in accented but clear English, "this does not concern you. We seek justice from our own people." "Justice for what?" Jenkins asked, and Samuel heard something in the man's voice that hadn't been there before. Doubt, maybe, or growing understanding. "Justice for 30 dead women and children," Grey Wolf replied. "Justice for promises broken and blood spilled." Jenkins was quiet for a moment, and Samuel could almost see the man's world reshaping itself. "The attack yesterday, it really happened? You want proof?" Grey Wolf reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out something that gleamed in the lamplight. He tossed it at Jenkins's feet. "That belonged to my daughter. She was 8 years old." Jenkins bent down and picked up a small silver cross on a chain, the kind missionaries gave to converted Apache children. In the lamplight, Samuel could see dark stains on the metal that might have been blood. "Jesus," Private Miller whispered from the shadows where he had taken position. "Your captain ordered it," Grey Wolf continued, his voice like gravel. "Your soldiers did it. Now these 3 pay the price for your army's lies." "They didn't tell the army anything," Jenkins said, and Samuel was surprised by the conviction in his voice. "How do you know this?" Grey Wolf demanded. "Because we've been watching them for 4 days. They never left the ranch. They never spoke to anyone except us, and they sure didn't tell us about any peaceful camps." Jenkins paused. "And because I'm starting to think my captain lied to me about a lot of things." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of more horses approaching. Everyone turned to see Captain Hayes riding hard toward the ranch with a full squad of cavalry behind him. Someone must have reported the Apache presence, or perhaps Hayes had been planning to return anyway. "This is about to get very bad very quickly," Samuel muttered. Hayes and his men thundered into the yard, weapons drawn, shouting orders to surrender. Grey Wolf and his warriors immediately took cover behind whatever they could find, their own weapons ready. The sisters found themselves caught in the middle, with soldiers on one side and angry Apache on the other. "Captain Hayes," Samuel called out, stepping onto the porch with his hands visible but his shotgun still in reach. "These people came here to talk. They came here armed for war," Hayes shouted back. "Stand aside, Morrison." "No," Samuel said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "I won't stand aside while you murder innocent people. Those Apache killed my men." "No," Corporal Jenkins said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "They didn't, sir. And I don't think the Apache who did kill our men were anywhere near that peaceful camp you ordered attacked yesterday." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel saw Hayes's face go white in the lamplight as he realized his own man had just accused him of war crimes in front of witnesses. "Corporal Jenkins, you're under arrest for insubordination," Hayes said finally. "Yes, sir," Jenkins replied. "I figured I would be." The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap. Apache warriors faced cavalry soldiers across 30 feet of dusty ground with 3 sisters and 1 stubborn rancher caught in the middle. Everyone had weapons. Everyone had grievances, and everyone had reasons to fight. The war that couldn't be avoided had finally arrived in full force, and Samuel realized that the next few minutes would determine whether it ended in justice or simply added more bodies to the growing pile of the dead. The moment balanced on a knife's edge with death waiting in every direction. Samuel could feel the tension radiating from every person in the yard, could see fingers tightening on triggers and hands gripping weapon handles. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the shooting would start. That was when Itzel did something that no one expected. The youngest of the 3 sisters, the quiet one who carried a wooden cross, stepped off the porch and began walking directly toward the space between the 2 armed groups. "Itzel, no," Ayanna hissed, but her sister didn't stop. The young Apache woman walked steadily forward until she stood in the open ground between the cavalry and Grey Wolf's warriors. She held her wooden cross in one hand and her Winchester rifle in the other, but the rifle was pointed at the ground. "Stop," she said, her voice soft but somehow carrying to every person in the yard. "Everyone just stop." "Get out of the way, girl," Captain Hayes commanded. "This doesn't concern you." Itzel turned to face him, and Samuel was struck by how small she looked surrounded by armed men and their violence. But her voice was steady, unafraid. "It concerns me more than anyone else, Captain. You want to arrest my sisters for something they didn't do. Grey Wolf wants to kill us for something we didn't do. And all of you are about to start shooting each other over lies and misunderstandings." She turned to address Grey Wolf. "Uncle," she said in English so everyone could understand, "you know our mother. You know who we are. Do you really believe we would betray our own people to save ourselves?" Grey Wolf's weathered face was stone, but Samuel saw something flicker in his eyes. "Your mother was a good woman, child. But you live with whites now. You speak their language, follow their God." He gestured at the cross in her hand. "I follow the same God our people have always followed," Itzel replied. "The one who created the mountains and the sky, who sends rain to make the corn grow. The missionaries just gave me a different name for him." She turned back to Captain Hayes. "And Captain, you've been watching us for 4 days. Have we done anything that looked like helping raiders? Have we sent signals, passed messages, done anything except work around this ranch and try to stay alive?" Hayes said nothing, but Samuel could see the uncertainty in his face. "The truth is," Itzel continued, raising her voice so everyone could hear clearly, "the real raiders are still out there. While you're all pointing guns at each other, they're probably planning their next attack. And the real traitor, the one who told you where to find that peaceful camp, is still free." "What are you talking about?" Hayes demanded. Nalnish spoke up from his position near the porch.
"She speaks truth, Captain.
The attack on your supply convoy, it was led by a war chief called Red Hawk. He has maybe 20 warriors, and they hide in the deep canyons to the west." "How do you know this?" Grey Wolf asked suspiciously. "Because," Nalnish said quietly, "I was one of them. Until I saw what happened to the peaceful camp." The admission hit the gathered men like a physical blow. Several weapons swung toward Nalnish, but he continued speaking, his voice steady. "I joined Red Hawk because I was angry about broken treaties, about land taken and promises ignored. I thought fighting was the only way to make the whites listen." He paused, looking around at the hostile faces. "But when I saw those dead children yesterday, saw what our raids had caused, I knew it was wrong." "You admit to killing soldiers?" Hayes asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I admit to being a fool," Nalnish replied. "But I'm trying not to be a fool anymore." Grey Wolf stepped forward, his tomahawk still in his hand. "You betray your own war chief? You betray your brothers?" "My brothers died yesterday when soldiers killed innocent children in revenge for what we did," Nalnish said. "Red Hawk's war isn't about protecting our people anymore. It's about his own anger and pride." Samuel saw the terrible logic of it unfolding. The raids had prompted army retaliation against the nearest Apache, regardless of their guilt. The retaliation had turned peaceful Apache into enemies, and somewhere, the real raiders were probably laughing at how effectively they had turned everyone against each other. "So who told Captain Hayes where to find the peaceful camp?" Casa asked, speaking for the first time since the standoff began. Nalnish answered reluctantly. "A trader named Mackenzie. He sold information to Red Hawk about army patrols and information to the army about Apache camps. He played both sides." Samuel felt his blood go cold. "John Mackenzie? The man who owned this ranch?" "Yes. He took army money to point them toward the peaceful camp, knowing they would attack it. He thought it would draw attention away from Red Hawk's real hiding place." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Mackenzie hadn't just abandoned the ranch. He had deliberately left the 3 sisters to take the blame for his treachery. He had sold out peaceful Apache to protect hostile ones, all for money. "Where is Mackenzie now?" Hayes asked. "Gone north to Tucson, probably with enough money to start over somewhere else," Nalnish replied. Captain Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his weapon lowering slightly. Samuel could see the man struggling with the realization that he had been played, that his attack on the peaceful camp had been based on lies from a double agent. "Even if this is true," Hayes said finally, "I have orders to bring in any Apache found off the reservation." "Then arrest us," Ayanna said, stepping forward to stand beside Itzel. "But don't pretend we're warriors when we're not." Casa joined her sisters in the space between the 2 armed groups. "And don't pretend the army is protecting anyone when you're killing children." The 3 sisters stood together in the lamplight, facing down 2 groups of armed men who could kill them in an instant. But they stood with dignity, with their heads high and their backs straight. Grey Wolf looked at them for a long moment, then slowly returned his tomahawk to his belt. "You are not warriors," he said quietly. You are just young women trying to survive in a world gone mad. We all are, Itzel said softly. Apache, white, Mexican, it doesn't matter. We're all just trying to survive. Private Miller suddenly spoke up from his position. Captain, what if we're doing this wrong? What if instead of fighting each other, we went after the real enemy? You mean Mackenzie? Hayes asked. I mean Mackenzie and Red Hawk both. They're the ones who started this mess. They're the ones with blood on their hands. Samuel saw something shift in the captain's face, saw the possibility of redemption replacing the certainty of violence. That would mean working together, Hayes said slowly, looking at Grey Wolf. Apache and cavalry. Against common enemies, Grey Wolf agreed. It has been done before. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of men reconsidering their assumptions, of warriors wondering if there might be a better way to find justice than simply adding to the body count. The war that couldn't be avoided was about to take a turn that none of them had expected, toward something that looked almost like hope. 2 weeks later, Samuel stood on his porch watching the sunrise paint the red rocks gold and thinking about how much had changed since that night when war had come calling. The temporary alliance between Captain Hayes and Grey Wolf had worked better than anyone had expected, though it had cost more than Samuel liked to remember. The joint expedition to track down Red Hawk and his raiders had been successful, but brutal. They had found the war chief's camp in a hidden canyon and had given him a choice: surrender and face trial, or fight to the death. Red Hawk had chosen to fight, and he had died with weapons in both hands, unrepentant to the end. Most of his warriors had surrendered when they realized their cause was lost. Mackenzie had been harder to find. The double-dealing traitor had made it all the way to Tucson before Corporal Jenkins and 2 Apache trackers caught up with him. He was currently sitting in a military prison awaiting trial for treason, espionage, and conspiracy. Samuel doubted the man would see freedom again, but the real victory, Samuel thought, was what had happened after the fighting ended. Captain Hayes had submitted a report that painted the 3 Apache sisters as valuable allies rather than suspected enemies. Grey Wolf had vouched for their character before the tribal council, and gradually, impossibly, peace had begun to take root. The sisters were still living on the ranch, but now they had official status as civilian contractors for the army, serving as interpreters and cultural advisors. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than being hunted by both sides. More importantly, it gave them a chance to help other Apache navigate the dangerous waters between 2 cultures. Samuel heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Ayanna approaching with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and stood beside him watching the sunrise. Nalnish is leaving today, she said quietly. Samuel nodded. The young Apache warrior had been struggling with his role in the raids that had started the whole mess. Even though he had helped bring Red Hawk to justice, he couldn't forgive himself for the part he had played in the violence. Where will he go? Back to the reservation, at least for now. He wants to help the families who lost people in the army attack. He thinks maybe he can do some good there. Samuel sipped his coffee and considered this. What about you 3? Are you planning to stay here permanently? Ayanna was quiet for a moment. Casa wants to go east, maybe to one of those schools for Indian children. She says she wants to learn to be a teacher. Come back and help Apache children learn to read and write in both languages. And Itzel wants to become a missionary herself. She thinks there's a need for someone who understands both Apache and white ways, someone who can build bridges instead of walls. That sounds like her, Samuel said with a smile. What about you? Ayanna looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I like it here. This place feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has. But I know you didn't buy this ranch planning to run a boarding house for Apache women. Samuel laughed. I didn't buy this ranch planning for a lot of things that happened. But you know what? This place works better with you 3 here than it ever would have without you. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert come alive with the new day. In the distance, Samuel could see Nalnish preparing his horse for the journey back to the reservation. The young man moved with purpose now, no longer the desperate warrior who had brought news of tragedy, but someone who had found a different kind of strength. Mr. Morrison, Ayanna said suddenly, can I ask you something? Samuel, he corrected. After everything we've been through, I think we can use first names. Samuel, then, why did you help us? You could have turned us over to the army or to Grey Wolf. It would have been easier, safer for you. Samuel thought about the question seriously. You remember the first day I got here? You asked me if I was the new owner, and I said I was. But you three had been here your whole lives. How could I be the owner of your home? Ayanna smiled. So you were just being practical? No, Samuel said quietly. I was trying to be the kind of man my wife would have wanted me to be. She always said that when you see something wrong happening, you have two choices. You can be part of the problem or part of the solution. There's no middle ground. Captain Hayes rode up to the house just as they finished their coffee. The army officer had changed over the past 2 weeks, becoming less rigid and more thoughtful. Samuel suspected the experience had taught him some hard lessons about the difference between following orders and doing what was right. Morning. Samuel Ayanna, Hayes said, dismounting and accepting a cup of coffee from Casa, who had appeared with perfect timing. I wanted to stop by before heading back to the fort. Any news from headquarters? Samuel asked. Some good, some bad. The good news is that my report about the peaceful camp attack has resulted in some changes in policy. We're supposed to verify intelligence before acting on it now, and we're required to have Apache advisors on any future operations. And the bad news? Hayes sighed. There are people in Washington who don't like the idea of Apache and cavalry working together. They think it sets a dangerous precedent. Itzel joined them on the porch, her wooden cross catching the morning light. Dangerous for who? For people who profit from the war continuing, Hayes said bluntly. There's money in conflict, in military contracts and land speculation. Peace is bad for business. Samuel felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. So what happens now? Now we do what we can where we can and hope it's enough, Hayes replied. The territorial governor is interested in establishing a formal program using Apache advisors. If it works here, it might spread to other areas. They talked for a while longer about practical matters, about the ranch and the ongoing efforts to build trust between the Army and local Apache bands. But eventually Hayes had to leave and the others dispersed to their daily tasks, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts. As he watched his strange new family go about their morning routine, Samuel reflected on how different his life had become from what he had planned. He had come to Arizona Territory looking for a fresh start, a place to build a simple life raising cattle or horses. Instead, he had found himself in the middle of a war that had taught him that there were no simple answers to complex problems. But he had also found something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own survival and comfort. The 3 Apache sisters had given him back his faith in the possibility that people could choose to do the right thing even when it was difficult and dangerous. The war that couldn't be avoided had been fought and, in its own small way, won. Not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple recognition that the enemy wasn't always who you thought it was, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was to lower your weapon and start talking. Samuel finished his coffee and went to start his day, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't be facing them alone. In a territory where trust was rare and friendship dangerous, he had found both in the most unlikely place: a cheap ranch, 3 Apache girls, and a war that had taught them all the difference between fighting for something and fighting against everything. The sunrise was complete now, and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, full of both promise and peril. But for the first time since arriving in Arizona Territory, Samuel Morrison felt like he was exactly where he belonged.